Well, welcome everyone to IAS 333. This is my last year of teaching, I should say that, and my name is Wayne Cristordo. I'm professor in politics here. My major background is in social and political philosophy with a very strong historical bent, but I also have strong interests in all manner of other subjects, including sociology, anthropology. Because ultimately, as you'll see when I deliver the lectures, my approach is a very holistic approach. Now, no one actually sees the whole of everything. We only ever see bits and pieces. But one problem I do find with the compartmentalizations of our understanding of humanity, or if you like, the arts and humanities, is that those disciplinary boundaries often get in the way. So I try to smash those disciplinary boundaries because all we have is a reality that we're trying to make sense of and that we participate in. Now, in this course, we are going to look at some of the greatest minds that have ever responded to the political havoc and circumstances of their day. There is a reason that we can speak about these authors as canonical, and that is because in some way, shape or form, all of them have had a profound influence upon the understanding of political phenomena, the understanding of human behavior. Many, not all, have had a huge philosophical impact that circulates way beyond their specific political and social insights. Plato, for example, as we'll see, is really one of the most important founders of philosophy. So he opens up a path, even though he's taught, which I'll explain a bit later. There are philosophers that precede him, but there's something that he introduces that changes the whole game. Okay, we will also be doing in this course, I make no apology for this, we'll be talking a lot about religion. And we're going to be talking a lot about religion for the simple reason is that not only Western society, but pretty well all society, in fact, all societies in some way, shape or form, have been shaped, hugely shaped by the stories they tell about the gods or God and the human condition. It's only really in very modern times, with a few exceptions of some philosophers, not that many actually. When I speak of modern times, I'm speaking from the 1700s on. And then only with a relatively small group at that time. But now we take our secular society for granted, so religion is more or less seen as a private matter, which of course is not in big parts of the world. That's not the case at all. But in the West, because of something that I will talk about later called the Reformation, that's been one of the legacies of the Reformation. So there will be a lot of talk about religion, and what I will be trying to do is to get you to understand a religious sensibility. So it's not a question of you being religious or me being religious or anything like that. Get that out of your head, or I don't like religion or anything like that. That's just silly. We live in a whole different set of circumstances, a whole different set of pressures upon us, and we respond very differently. And the consensuses that have been socially formed, which we may or may not particularly like, but nevertheless that they have institutional efficacy and dominance, that is so different to what other peoples have had in the past, and as I said, some parts of the world still to this day. And that makes an understanding of what is happening in other parts of the world. In two other subjects of mine, I do talk about Islam at some length. And that's because it's a huge part of a mindset in which religion really, really matters and is not compartmentalized in the way in which Christianity, for example, in the West, but which was such a hugely formative force within the West, is now in operation. So I want you to get a sense, a taste for other ways of thinking. And that's another thing, a really important thing that we're doing in the course. We're moving through different times, and I use the plural quite deliberately because I think social time should not be confused with mechanical time. Mechanical time is when I just break down things into minutes, hours, even years. and think there's a regularity there, which for all sorts of social practices, such as farming, when floods would come, when to plant, when to sow, those kind of things, really were responsible for people having a regular time chronicle, that is, calendar. And the calendars, in fact, calendars plural, is a really intrinsic part of human social formation, of human social grouping, especially once it reaches a certain scale, and especially once you have a division of labour, where you really do require some people to go and plant the seeds at the right time of the year and harvest at the right time of the year. But social time is of a very different order, and it's generally not spoken about or even recognised, because mechanical time has become so ubiquitous in the way we think. So I'll say I'm giving this lecture in the year 2020, and everyone thinks, oh yeah, I know that. Of course, but that particular way of breaking up time, what's that predicated on? What, 2020 since what? Since before the birth of Christ. Since the birth of Christ. Or what, in more secular terms, has been made a little bit less provocative, because the secular mentality wants to, in a sense, occlude the religious components or translate them into more secular terminology. We say before the Common Era. That's actually a bit of chicanery, really. It's a bit of nonsense, really. The Common Era, what Common Era? You know, the era is only common for people that are living in that time. And till this day, there are people that follow in different calendars. Again, Muslims have a very different calendar to the West. So when I speak about social time as well, what is really behind that is a recognition that there's certain founding acts which you could say open up a new time. And by a new time, I mean a new way of being in the world, in which living and dying and transmitting the information that you've managed to gather or inherit through the practices you're involved in. And we can see the way in which different times, if we think a bit and look a bit, the way in which different times get cemented within the more common time, the common time being either a more mechanical time or something like the Common Era, where there's a consensus about this is the calendar we're going to follow. If we think of things like, for example, when I was much younger, it was very common to see nuns in their habits walking on the streets, or priests with their collars walking on the streets. And that uniform, so to speak, was really a sign of the founding act in which their mentality was still being dictated to in very important ways, not in every way, because people are living in a multiplicity of times, if you like, because a multiplicity of different founding acts, of different practices. Philosophy, as we'll speak about, is one such practice. And when we're looking at Plato and Socrates, we're looking at founders of a particular practice. And as I will also go into more detail, the enormous influence of philosophy, which wasn't all of a piece, it wasn't enormously influential in one go. It took a long, long time of incubation, of really not mattering that much at all. But in modern times, philosophy starts to play a very big part, a much, much bigger role in your life than you would possibly conceive of, unless you've already done a fair bit of reading about the history of philosophy and history more generally. And if you've read some history more generally, you'd learn of a period called the Enlightenment, and you would see how important the Enlightenment was in shaping the Western tradition. And then through the Western tradition, that impacts globally, it circulates globally. Again, it circulates in a way in which there's this collision of different times. So we're not all contemporaries. And you know this, if you travel and you meet indigenous people who still have that traditional life way, or even as in Australia, where we have indigenous people in many ways caught up in different worlds, they're really being caught up in different times. So how to navigate the times requires at least one thing, and I concede from the outset, because of the brevity of the course, we're only doing 12 weeks, I am focusing on Western ideas, which have to some extent become universalized, not without great problems accompanying that universalization. I won't really have much time to talk about that, but I'll just give you one quick example. The modern nation state. One of the legacies of the modern nation state was with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War and the carving up of all these territories in the Middle East. That was the imposition of a set of institutions and a mindset that dominated those institutions that really came out of Western experience. And it hasn't taken very well. One of the real problems that's coming out of the Middle East is the failure of the nation state to really take root, and the different kinds of political formations that have gathered around the various nation states of those periods, leading from basically a strongman kind of ruler to military dictatorships, and then the pan-Islamist revolution. I'm simplifying this, but the pan-Islamist revolution is very much a reaction to that. It's really a reaction of people whose own sense of being, whose own practices are basically occupying a very different social zone. Now, this gets very complicated because when you speak about different professions, professions are also acts based upon foundations. And it's not surprising that a banker in Saudi Arabia, in spite of various constraints, from at least from a Western point of view, around the banking system that Islam projects onto that, but a banker from the Middle East, say, a banker from India and a banker from New York will often have more in common. They're sharing many practices that pull them into a social common time than other people who in completely different lines of work in which they never engage in the kind of conversations, the kind of values, the kind of appeals that people in those professions have. And yet, of course, within a community, because there's going to be a seepage in people between different peoples or different practicing different things, you see this gets very, very complicated as people will start to talk about something like culture, and culture meaning a sort of, we use a word like, or we're quite happy in saying this is from an Australian perspective, or this is from a male perspective, or this is from a female perspective. If you think about that for a while, say about 2 seconds, you'd realise, what the hell are they talking about? There is no just one perspective, because culture too, like time, is plural. I don't want to go, I will talk about culture much later in the semester. Okay, I've thrown you in a way to an overview. I'm going to backpedal now, and I'm going to backpedal in terms of, I just want to talk about some of the formatting of the course, or rather the technicalities of the course, and just quickly run you through that, okay? So in terms of the thing you most need to know what's going on from week to week to week is this unit guide, which I'm not sure if I'm coming through on any video here. I thought it had been, but I can't see it there. But there is what's called the unit information guide. You will find that somewhere in your Learn line under unit information. Print that out and look at that very carefully. It will tell you what we're doing from week to week. It will identify for you the readings that you need to do. And this course is going to make much more sense if you, the optimum way to do this is to listen to the lecture and do the reading, and then if we can, we talk about it. But because I've got so much stuff to get through, and it's because I'm not dealing with information that is widely known, that I can't just throw us straight into a conversation. So I need to give you a lot of information to make sense of this. And one of the ways I give that information is I'll be going forwards and backwards, leaping ahead around the times, and try to get you, I'm throwing you into this kind of historical tumult. But believe me, I've done this for a long time. After a while, things that are new to you will become familiar, and I will be going back and forwards. So I'll be anticipating some developments. They weren't intended necessarily, not at all. For example, when we talk about Aristotle, we're also talking about one of the most important influences upon the medieval university. Aristotle, 350 to 400 years before the Common Era, before the birth of Christ, before, BC. Then he gets rediscovered in something like 1100 AD, and he hasn't been doing that much. There's been, some Arabs have been reading him, and there are a few people reading, but it hasn't had much institutional efficacy nor many readers as a whole. And then he comes back and plays a very important role. That's a big gap. You think about that, that's a huge gap. In chronological time, that's a massive gap. And it's also a massive gap in terms of social time, because how the Athenians lived and who was Aristotle's audience and who he was don't have much in common with those monks and priests and learned people coming out of the Middle Ages. But still, big influence. So when I talk about Aristotle, for example, I will anticipate that, and then we'll go back and forwards. Okay. Now, back to the course guide. In the course guide, look, two things that are absolutely important to get out of the way are the assessments. So there's two kinds of assessments in the course. The first one is, you'll see that we've basically covered 12 topics, and one of the pieces of assessment is you take any 6 of those topics and you answer any 3 of the questions. There might be 5 or 6 questions, and you give them to me. Don't do it till you've heard the lecture, because if you've heard the lecture, you're going to do much better. And I can basically tell from your answers if you've listened to the lecture. Obviously, you 3 are here, and we're doing the lecture. So, okay. So is that clear? 6 weeks worth, 3. It's not a mini essay. I'm not looking. Don't quote stuff. I want to know you've just understood it. I don't even care if it's in point form. But it's basically 2 paragraphs per answer, so about 1.5 pages, 1 page to 1.5 pages per that. So all in all, that's going to come to, I don't know, what's that, 9 pages or whatever it is. Okay. The next thing is an essay. I will go into more detail about that as the semester progresses, but I'll just basically say this is an opportunity for you. I want you to compare 2 of the thinkers that we're discussing throughout the course, and whereas in the readings I just give you snippets. I want you to have a deeper reading and you to show me that you've read more widely and deeply. Now, I'm interested in this course in primary sources. I think I said earlier, you are reading some of the most influential minds that have ever put pen to paper, some of the most thoughtful people that have discussed politics. Look, I've got to get this off my chest, but I've been teaching politics for a long time. People love talking about politics. Most of what people talk about when they talk about politics really just comes from a position of their interest and a consensus they've built up, and it's not scholarly. It's not scholarly at all. Here, we're doing it in a scholarly way. So I'm not interested, I'm seriously not interested in what your political opinions as such are. I'm a guitar player, right? And guitar players all know where they're at. They can tell who's better than them. They can tell when they're struggling with something. Now, people, when they have political discussions, they never think, oh, I haven't really thought that much about this, that, or this. Whereas a guitar player would think, oh, God, how did they do that? So there's something, they recognize there's something more to learn if you're learning an instrument, or if you're an artist, or anything which really requires gathering talent, gathering more skills. And I find most people who discuss politics, they basically think it's easier to change the world than to change a tire on a car or something. You know, this I think is very unfortunate, because I think it leads to a very poor political culture of very poor public narratives, which has a big impact on the political culture. It leads to a lot of divisiveness, a lot of social hostility, and a lot of people think they're right and the other person is wrong. And if one thought more like an artist or a musician, one would say, well, let's try and think of how to do this better. Now, this is not inappropriate when we're going to talk about Plato, because as we will see, skills, it's the skill mentality, and there's going to be some problems with that, as we'll see, is what drives Plato, because that's his understanding of knowledge. It's very much skill-based. The word techne is a Greek word for skill, so he sees it in a very technical term. And the word ocracy is basically meaning rulership. That's a rulership of skill. We get aristocracy is another word. Democracy, the rule of the demos. Aristocracy is the rule of the best. So these are Greek terms. Most, by the way, when we're starting with the Greeks, most of your language about knowledge really comes back to the Greeks because of the way in which they compartmentalized the information that they were looking for to try and make sense of the world around them. Okay, any questions so far? So when you get to the essay, that's clear. Dates about the essay are on there. Any questions so far? No. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so get the course guide, look at that, do the readings, and then we can have a discussion about that. I'm quite happy if we continue doing. Yes.
Sorry, general question. So just to clarify.
Yeah.
Each so the assignment 1 is just each week we have readings and we answer the questions and just combine them, and that's a combination.
Yeah. Look, there's two. This is for the quizzes, right? The quizzes.
Yeah.
Okay. There's two ways you can do it. You can give me all your answers at the end of the semester.
Okay.
It's probably better for you, if you can manage your time, to do the answers that you choose to do closer to the time that you've heard the lecture, and then you'll have time to get some feedback on how you're making sense of things. But I gave people, because so many people were asking for extensions, I thought, okay, if you just want it all at the end, then I don't have any time to give you any kind of feedback that's going to help you with the essay. Look, a big part of what you're going to be learning about is how to think about these things. That's how to go and think about these things. And when I say thinking is very question related. That's why this unit guide is full of questions, because basically information is always going to be an answer to some question. There's there's the information of a truck hitting you. It's a kind of information that registers with the brain or kills you. It doesn't have time to register, but it registers with other people that are witnesses to that. But in the main, the way to think is to ask a question and then start exploring through that question. That's what I was really getting at too when I was saying one of the things that drives me about political discussion is the questions are answered very quickly. And when we're speaking about something as complicated as human society, and human society is extraordinarily complicated because people come from these different times. They value different things. And even when there's because some things we can recognize, but that's only partially helpful, even when we can see certain things in common. You might, for example, say everybody wants to survive. Well, would that were so, but it's not true. It's absolutely not true. Some people have a death wish. Some cultures may have a death wish. So this is when we ask a question, we're really beginning on a path to try and open up how we understand things. We're opening up our understanding, and that's the whole point of reading these people. It's not simply I want to say that Plato or Aristotle or whoever are right. To me, that's completely uninteresting. Right against what? Who would judge it? What would the criteria be? And of course, philosophy is something that tries to lay down those criteria. Now, I just wrote a book that came out at the end of last year called Idolizing the Idea, in which one of the central arguments I'm making is philosophers can't agree with themselves about almost anything except that they value philosophy. But the answers they get, they differ so vastly that you see, well, it's only partially helpful. And in part, that's because philosophy is only one particular practice. And when we go closer in a moment into Plato's writings, we'll see that he is defining philosophy against other practices that were really important in terms of educating the Greeks. And he was very hostile to those other practices. So philosophy was aspiring to be the ruler of how we see things. It would rule our ideas. Have you got a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that thing about the other just again. So you're saying 3 questions from one particular week that we choose
Yes.
only?
Yeah, and then you choose 6 weeks worth. So all in all, I'm going to get 6 lots of 3 questions.
6 lots of 3 questions. All right, got it.
Okay.
That
Okay,
makes
everybody
sense.
got that. 6 lots of 3 questions.
So basically,
As I said, about a page and a half. Yeah, sure. That's about a page and a half each. Not for each answer, for each lot of 3 answers. So
right.
basically 2 paragraphs
Okay.
for an answer. I'm
That
wanting you to
makes
pick
sense.
the eyes out of it. I don't want you to be quoting stuff. I don't want you to be copying from stuff. It's not a minor essay.
So,
This is an insight into your understanding of what's going on in the lectures and the PowerPoint.
so that's why you said it's better to hand your answers in after each lecture.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
But if we
This will
say handed 2 of them at the same time a
That's
week later,
fine
that's
too.
fine as well.
But don't do it until I've got the lecture.
Yeah.
Until you've had the lecture.
Yeah.
Because for me, I put a lot of time and energy into designing these lectures. As you can see, I've been thinking about this a long time. The lectures are never done quite the same way, except the PowerPoints.
Yeah.
Make sure that some of the same essential ideas get repeated, but the way I assemble it and the way I discuss it is going to vary from year to year.
So that thing you were talking about before about how people like to talk about politics, do you mean that whole idea of people who have knowledge and people who have opinions? Is that what you're talking about? So people who like to talk about politics, it's all
Well,
opinions
that's a
without
very
knowledge.
good question, because that's a very Platonic distinction is between opinion and knowledge, and I will talk about that. Are you you're familiar with Plato at all?
Read it.
But that's a fundamental that becomes a fundamental cleavage. And but the thing is, even with knowledge, because as Aristotle, who we will look at, points out, political knowledge is a kind of practical wisdom. It's a kind of practical knowledge. So one of the things is that people have very different knowledge because they're engaged in different practices. They see the world through their practice. So someone who teaches at a university or someone who's a civil servant generally is engaged in a very different practice to someone who's a coal miner or a farmer. And the things that matter to one lot may not matter so much to the other lot. Though, of course, in the case of farming, everyone needs to eat. One of the earliest transformations that we see in human society, and this is something that happens in Greece, is when there is a big class of citizens whose dependency upon whose relationship to farming starts to dwindle. When the Greek cities began, they were all built around farms. In fact, all our cities were built around farming. You remember the lecture I gave, maybe you do, but the lecture I gave when I was talking about the Middle Ages, and I talked about the fair. The village fair was the surplus produce from farms, and that was really because at that stage, urban life had been almost completely destroyed in Western Europe. So I'm talking about the 10th, 11th centuries here. And then when that produce came, that enabled a reboot of urban life. But once you've got urban life, you've got all sorts of professionals now, lawyers, for example, orators, tradesmen, who don't do any farming. And one of the things that we see happening is that there's a very different kind of mentality that comes out of the urban group to the rural group. In fact, there's a guy called Mike Duncan who's done a great podcast series on revolutions. It's really fantastic. He's a political scientist too, and like me, political science moving into history. And he was asked by someone, what do you think is the biggest single indicator of the way people vote, of people's political preferences? And he said, that's a hard one, but I'd probably say it's whether you're urban or rurally based. And that was always the case. That has always been the case. So this is why, remember I said earlier, sociology I think is very important. This is one reason why sociology is important. And one of the dangers of philosophy is dealing with principles. So it just tends to cut through those other kind of distinctions, which really do matter a lot. Because as I come back to, it's the practice that you're engaging gives you the information that you think is valuable. And we can only basically absorb so much information. So how we prioritize the different values, what we consider really important and what's not so important, and then how we apply that to the information that we're taking in, it's basically related to what we're doing, who we are. This is why the concept of identity is very important, but it tends to be wildly oversimplified in contemporary narrative, and in ways I find really quite thoughtless and stupefying, really, when people start talking about identity but not really poking away at it. And one of the great things about philosophy is the poking around. You should poke around and not just defend a principle no matter what. But then to poke around, that's when you need other information, and that's why studying other subjects. One which, by the way, I'm not sure this is dealt that well within the subject of the name, and possibly better in literature, not literary studies, but literature, is psychology. The reason I say literature, or in films, or in drama, is because when you're reading literature, or watching a good film, or watching a good TV show, the psychology really matters. Now, when it comes to knowing stuff, psychology is really important. And that can't be taught because you've got a psychology. That's something that you develop. And that is, your psychology is also something that guides which things you see are important. So there's a sociological aspect, but there's also a psychological aspect. Then there's going to be a historical aspect, because the sociological circumstances you're in are also very much bound up with the historical bound up with the cultural. And you see everything starts to bleed into each other, which brings us to Socrates, who said, the one thing I know is that I know nothing. This is the great foundational thought and insight of Socrates, and Plato was the student of Socrates, though people have often quipped that Socrates went from I know nothing to Plato, who basically knew everything. So there's really a question of, are you serious in your humility around knowledge, or do you use that to try and build something ultimately which is just making too big a claim? Okay, I'll come back to Plato and Socrates. Let's start with one of the, through the course, the different phases that we're going to work through, what I call the classical period. Then we're going to look at the Christian era. That's going to take up about 5 or 6 weeks worth, because it is so important. And most Western people don't realize the extent to which their ideas were already percolating, already brewing, already being created within a culture that was not that philosophical. So although in terms of temporality, we're starting with the Greeks. And one reason, with the Greeks are not the first people to organize themselves politically. Of course not. What you have, though, is you have various different kinds of political organizations. And the most elemental, which is in a way pre-political, the word political, by the way, comes from the Greek word polis, meaning city. And polites is someone who has rights within that city, or someone who's a citizen of that city. Now I'm doubting is a word, polito is that. But anyway, political, let's just say political, polito is political, polis. Okay, so one of the most common social formations, it begins with the earliest that we know is what's called a band. That's a very loosely scattered group of people. And as far as we can tell, that's how human beings start. They all start in some way in some kind of band. Once they reach a certain scale, once they're able to find enough peace within groups, and they reach some decisions about, or common decisions, and work a common level of cooperation that can bring the bands together, and they've got the tribes. But usually the tribes also can be broken down in terms of families as well. So that's that. So the family is a very archaic institution. The band is in a sense a pre-tribal institution. But tribes, once they get to a certain scale, they become what's called chiefdoms, and that's usually a large number of tribes that have been put together. And then when they found a way, when the group has found a way to have a broader division of labour in which there is the prospect or the possibility of farming, and usually that requires being near some alluvial plain and rivers, and so that they can farm continuously as opposed to more sporadic kinds of quasi-farming, if you like, but more settled life and not moving around, but a settled life. Then you'll have farmers, you'll have warriors protecting that, and you'll inevitably have the priests of one sort or another. That is, those that are looking for orientation. And prior to philosophy, and I would say this, there's intimations of this also in China, which there's aspects of Chinese civilization that have certain secular tendencies, which you can see in the writings of Confucius, for example, which comes from, again, an urban life, but also a capacity to reflect upon things and a greater trust in one's own mind rather than the stories that one has received. But the stories one has received are ultimately stories about how the spirits are operative in the world and how we're responsive to the spirits. So in this sense, the gods precede human beings. We tell stories about the gods and then about the heroes and then about ourselves within that. And this is very cross-cultural. It's absolutely anthropologically a seeming constant of what human beings are like. But once certain social formations evolve, then there's changes that are going on. And one of the big changes is in just how people talk about things. And that's where philosophy comes in. Philosophy is starting to talk about things in a different way. And it's because this combination of certain features of political life and political life emerge in ancient Greece, that even though the Greeks ultimately get overrun by the Romans, we tend in the West to base political thought back to Greece. Even though, as I said, you can find other examples elsewhere. You can find it in China, you can find it in India. But in the main, the one thing that separated the Greeks was the kind of society it was, and they were city-states. Often, where you had cities in other locations, they would tend to move into empires and be coordinated. And the typical form of political coordination and organization is an empire, is an emperor. So you've got a realm. So you've got these various cities. You still have to deal with the fact that you've got, because you need someone to control organization. You need someone to deal with the conflicts that are going on. You need someone to manage the show, if you like. And that's often various leaders within cities, various families within cities. But invariably it becomes kind of empire. The whole story of the modern Greeks is that, sorry, not Greeks, the ancient Greeks. The whole story of the ancient Greeks is that they had found a relatively unique kind of social formation. That is, there were multiple city-states, each of were independents. And within that independence, they had a great deal of division of labour on a scale that enabled a degree of freedom that simply wasn't the case elsewhere. So this is something quite unique. Now, as this is happening, of course, when I later talk about Christian political philosophy, that's all predicated from the Jewish experience. And the Jewish experience and way in talking about the world is very different to the Greek experience and the Greek way of talking about it. Because the thing that's basically lacking is this kind of social formation that the Jews had as opposed to what the Greeks had. They didn't have city-states, to put it bluntly. Now, and they end up having a very different vocabulary. So, for example, the word philosophy does not appear in the Bible until the New Testament. And when it does appear in the New Testament, we see that St. Paul is very critical of philosophy. Why is that? Because, and in this sense, the Bible is much more similar to other archaic societies than the Greeks are. And that is because it is basically a God-based command story that holds things together. As I said, China's somewhat different. It's in some ways it's a bit closer to the Greeks, but I don't want to go into that. It gets too complex. But I'm just giving you this overview, if you like, this picture to see. There's Greeks and there's Jews. When we do get to Christian political thought, we will see that there's a certain overlap starts to take place. There's a certain bleeding of each into the other. So I said the Greek experience is not only the establishment of city-states, and it really, if one reads, for example, the great foundational text of the Greeks, and it really is a foundational text of the Greeks, that's Homer's Iliad, and in Homer's Iliad, the second book of the Iliad, has a section where you see all the different villages who have sent troops to go and fight. Do you remember the Trojan War is about the abduction of Menelaus's wife, Greek's wife, by Paris. Paris is a Trojan, beautiful Helen. He abducts her, and Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon, they get a group of Greeks to go and fight for their pride, and they ultimately defeat the Trojans. Now, one of the interesting things about that story is at that stage the Greeks are basically living in hamlets and villages. It's very small, it's not urban, whereas Troy is urban. And it ultimately gets defeated. But the picture we have of the Greeks is they're basically brigands and bandits raiding. And, they have a reason to do the raids. Their honour has been slighted and they're getting his wife back, etc. But this is the bonding, founding story of the Greeks, is in Homer, so the Greeks now recognize each other as Greeks, even though there was no centralized political coordinating system in that recognition. They're still independent. Now, the other thing I should just briefly mention is that the other great moment of bonding of the Greeks was the attack by the Greeks by the Persians. And for the Greeks, the Persians were the enslavers. The Greeks, of course, had slaves as well, not on the scale of the Romans. But the Greeks saw the Persians as basically this great empire in which only one person, the emperor, was free, whereas the Greeks saw themselves as free. So Spartans and Athenians, I'm going to talk about in a moment, about their clash and their collision. Very different, Spartans and Athenians. To put it bluntly, the Athenians become the urban sophisticates. And if one reads the great book, the greatest chronicle of what was called the Peloponnesian Wars, which again I'll speak about that in a moment in more detail, by Thucydides, this great historian of the Greeks. He says this is the greatest war that's ever been. I'm writing this book as an eternal, to show the eternal glory, in a sense, of who the Greeks are, but what caused this great schism. So when Thucydides writes this, when he's writing this chronicle of the war, he realizes that this is akin to what we would now call the World War. That's his world anyway, and it's a war between the different hegemons within Greece, Athenians and Spartans. And in that book, there's a magnificent section which is called Pericles' Funeral Horatio, in which he provides this great, and Pericles was renowned as a great speaker, and as we'll see in a moment, this becomes very important to the Greeks, is how well articulate they can be, their rhetorical prowess. And Pericles' funeral speech is all about the freedom and liberty of the Athenians, and that's obviously directed at the Spartans, who were much more like a military camp. Military, agrarian people is what the Spartans were. Urban, though, of course, they still needed an agrarian base. You need a food supply. That's a basis. That's the basis of all life, is having a food supply. And that's something that's easily forgotten in urban civilization. It gets taken for granted. Real thinking, which is what I'm hoping that you will learn from reading these, really important thinkers, means not taking things for granted. Recognizing that some aspect that is intrinsic to the development of something will still be there. The food supply is still necessary. So the rural-urban split, that can be very dangerous, because ultimately they become codependent. Because all the machinery for farmers that is made, for example, is an urban phenomenon. So there's this mutual dependency, but often it's often not seen as they start solely to think about their interests and not able to see their relationship, see their dependency. So if the first great war that united the Greeks, okay, let's say 3 great wars united the Greeks. The Trojan War, maybe mythic, maybe not, but then of course Schliemann went and discovered that in the 19th century. He discovered where Troy was, and he really discovered that by reading Homer. So it seems that it's likely that it was true, even if certain fabrications that go on in the telling of the tale. But certainly the Greeks believed it all to be true. They believed in those heroes. They took their sustenance from the stories about those heroes and about their own foundation. The Persian attempt to conquer the Greeks, and the ultimate defeat of the Persians by the Greeks. And the third one was an internal war between the Greeks, and that was after the war against the Persians. The naval fleet at Athens, who were a great sea power, they started to expand their influence. Ultimately, their leverage, they became a stronger hegemon against the leading power, against the Spartans, and they both had different city-states that were each aligned with them, and then they came into this major conflict. It's all outlined in Thucydides, and it's called the Peloponnesian Wars. Now, the Peloponnesian Wars is absolutely essential to understanding the backdrop to Plato and even to Socrates. Okay, so that very much has set up a whole set of problems which Plato is responding to. So again, one of the things I'll be drawing out in this course, which I touched on earlier, is that when a new kind of political philosophy develops, or a philosopher really sets to work about thinking, they're caught up in the tumult of their times, and they're trying to find a solution to the problems that they are facing. And the problem that Plato faced, the first biggest problem he faced, was the Athenians had executed Socrates, his teacher. This left an enormous impression upon him, because Plato thought Socrates was the wisest and best person that had ever lived. But what does it tell you about your own city-state if the Athenians have executed him? Why did the Athenians execute Socrates? What was Socrates doing? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, Socrates, and this would be the same as Plato, had a lot of sympathy for the Spartan way of life. They had a lot of sympathy for that. And in fact, one of Socrates' students had been in a dictatorship that, let's go back a bit, the Spartans won the Peloponnesian War. They won that war. And in the immediate aftermath of the defeat of the Athenians, a tyrannical group called the 30 was set up. And they were basically brutal, and they butchered the leading supporters of the democracy. Now, there'd been long tussles in Athens between tyrants and democrats, but ultimately the Democrats had won until this moment. So this was, momentarily, this was the end of the democracy. And Socrates was taken to court in part because he was seen as being a threat to the democracy. Now, it wasn't only because one of his students was part of the 30. It wasn't only because he had all sorts of sympathies with certain features of Spartan society. He was very critical of Pericles, the leader, for example, of the Athenians. But the Athenians were an interesting lot because the Athenians, they were democrats, but one of the political conventions or practices that they engaged in was ostracization. And ostracization meant you could no longer be involved in political life. And it very often happened, if someone had become too popular, then opposing forces would join forces against this popular figure. And this even happened to Pericles. He wasn't ostracized, but there were moves afoot to ostracize him. So this technique of ostracization is indicative of the kind of volatility and conflict that was typical of the democracy that was of Athenian democracy. So Socrates was simultaneously critical about all sorts of things of the democracy. And the biggest criticism, which is something that weaves its way through Plato's thinking, is that Socrates wants people to be able to define what they're doing in order to assess the value of what they're doing. To put that another way, people who hold important positions of power, people who exercise great pedagogical and political influence, they should know what they're doing. And the Socratic philosophy was really based upon a method in which you should not contradict yourself if you're describing what you're doing. Now, note this, and this is something a philosopher we'll look at much later in the course, a 19th century philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche, very important philosopher, points out, is that this is really an attack upon instinctual life. Because, again, if you play an instrument, or if you ride a bike, or you do anything, certain kind of, all sorts of practices, even driving, you can't really break it down into all the constitutive bits of what you're doing, because you're just doing it. And so the attack upon instinctive life is really requiring people's reflection upon what they're doing should dictate the value of what they're doing. Now, that meant that if a general, and there's a good example of this in Plato's dialogue called the Nicias, if the general stumbles around trying to define what they're doing, the implication is they're not a good general. That may or may not be true. If the poet is telling a story, but they're not really able to depict all the qualities required of someone to be a good practitioner of what they're doing within the story, that would also suggest they don't know what they're doing. And in fact, this is what Socrates is suggesting, and what Plato really develops, is the idea that Greece is in chaos, it's had all this civil war, and now it's killed the best person that's ever lived. and it's in chaos because no one knows what they're doing, or not enough people. Socrates knew what he was doing, but the rest of them don't seem to know what they're doing. Maybe Socrates' students, Plato thinks he knows what he's doing, but you have to know what you're doing before you do it. See, that's very plausible. There's something compelling, but as I said, there's also ways that you might think, hang on a minute, that's a problem. Now, let me go back a bit to this relationship between Plato and Socrates, and I'll point out we don't have any text by Socrates. Socrates spoke but did not write. What texts we have in which Socrates is seen to speak are texts by Aristophanes, who is a comic poet, who presents Socrates as a bit of a fool and a buffoon and a serious danger to the traditional order. And Plato will say in the book, in the dialogue, The Apology, which is the trial of Socrates, Plato will say Aristophanes is the real accuser of Socrates. He's the one that told all these stories about Socrates being pernicious. Now, the story that Aristophanes told was one in which Socrates had mastered the technique of making the unjust argument look just, of making the weaker argument look strong. I won't go into detail about the play. It's called The Clouds, in which Socrates figures. But I'll just mention that that title also brings in another element of the accusation against Socrates. Socrates was accused for corrupting the youth and of worshipping strange new gods. Corrupting the youth and worshipping strange new gods. Now, the corruption aspect that we see in Aristophanes is he's getting people to use bad arguments and have fun, turn against father. Ending the whole social order. Secondly, he argues that what Socrates is also doing is worshipping the new god, which is the clouds, which is really the figments of his own brain, his own reason. That's the clouds. In the play, the clouds, Socrates is actually swinging in a basket looking at clouds. But you can see the vapors, the clouds, as a metaphor for just what's going on in your own mind. So not taking the gods seriously. Now, Plato refutes this. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is very important in terms of the pedagogy, the education of the Greeks, is that in relatively recent times of Plato's and Aristophanes' life, a new lot of people had started appearing that call themselves sophists. Now, the word philosophy means love of wisdom. The word sophist basically means a wise guy, the sophist. So the sophists went round teaching people not only how to be good orators, because they were the orators as well. Plato distinguishes between the sophists and the orators. He's got a beef with them. You've got the statesmen, you've got the poets, who are the big guns, which we're going to come back to. They're the biggest, most important educators of Greece in terms of the stories that have been told, and you would even tell their stories in the law courts. The orators, who would teach you how to speak, and basically the sophists, who would teach you a whole curriculum about how to be smart so that when you did speak, you could gain political power. And they were seen by a lot of people as being really amoral, terrible people that were corrupting their children and making smart asses out of them. Okay, so they're the sophists. And what Aristophanes had done is he said, Socrates is a sophist. And the sophists are a danger and a threat to our world. And what Plato will argue, and I will come back to this, what Plato will argue is that there's a huge difference between philosophy and sophistry. And yet, from Aristophanes' position, that difference is never going to be so great. I don't think Plato could have ever convinced Aristophanes, because Aristophanes is interested in traditional stories about the gods and emphasizes the limitations of human knowledge. By the way, there's two classes of thoughtful people who have traditionally had, I won't say all of them by any means, not all of them by any means, but have had mounted very powerful critiques of philosophy. And that is certain religious figures, and the other is comedians. And Aristophanes is the beginning of that. In more modern times, there's a character called Rabelais, who wrote a great French chronicle in the middle 16th century where he's attacking the religious wars of what's going on in France at that time. But he is also attacking the know-allness of the philosophers. So there's, and in more ancient times in Rome, there's a guy called Lucan who also attacks that. So there's a strong tradition, a comedic tradition that's very critical of philosophy, because it's basically saying life is absurd and you're trying to make sense of something that isn't, that doesn't lend itself to being made that much sense of. Okay, so Plato and Socrates, though, Plato is influenced hugely by Socrates. Socrates has been condemned to death. Plato is basically doing a defense of Socrates. He not only writes a book called The Republic, the Apology, which is a discussion of the trial in which Socrates points out to his accusers that they've contradicted themselves, because they say you don't believe in the gods, but then you worship strange new gods. Well, which one is it? Which one is it? You can see for someone like Aristophanes, that's just messing around. You know, that's a bit of a trick. But for Plato, that's a very important distinction. Is it one or is it the other? Secondly, there's this the accusation of corruption, which is seen as corrupting the entire city. But it is also the thing that Socrates has done is introduced a method into thinking. So no one is denying, Plato's not denying, that people think before philosophy, but Plato is basically saying people aren't thinking well before philosophy. It's a little bit like someone coming along and saying, look, I see all you people walking, but you're not really walking properly. I hear you talking, but you're not really talking properly. And you go, well, hang on, what are you talking about? So what was it that Socrates introduced? Now, I've introduced part of it. I've already mentioned part of it. That is the idea of not contradicting yourself. And that's the principle called non-contradiction, the principle of non-contradiction. Aristotle, Plato's student, will mark all this out in much greater detail because he becomes really the founder of logic, even though certain elements of the importance of logic are already in Plato, and in fact goes back to one of Socrates' teachers, another great philosopher called Parmenides. I won't go into that, but the thing that makes Socrates so different is what I've already suggested. He goes around interrogating people. And the biggest, most important point of this law of non-contradiction is Socrates sees that whenever we talk about a particular subject matter, we're talking about different things that connect up. They connect up to the subject matter. And they call this the one and the many. So what are the many different examples? What do they all have in common to be seen as under a common genus or family? What do they all have in common? Or under a common topic? What do they all have in common? And that's what Socrates is doing. He's going around asking people to identify what he calls the thing in itself. That's initially a Socratic Platonic formulation. Now I said there were, let me go back a bit too, before I've forgotten that. Aristophanes was one of the people that talked about Socrates. The other was a guy called Xenophon, who had been a general and who was a great admirer of Socrates, but Socrates doesn't appear so philosophical. And the other one is Plato. And it's Plato's Socrates that is the most sophisticated. And although in bits of Xenophon we can see certain aspects of Socrates doing this. It's really in Plato that we can lay out what's called the Socratic method. And the Socratic method is one of inquiry. You inquire into something. I ask you something to try and pull out from you what you know, and then try and get you to clear yourself of your contradictions. So to free yourself of a contradiction and go along a road, which in some of the dialogues, ostensibly, they're called the early dialogues of Plato, and it said that Plato's dialogues could be divided into three parts. Those early dialogues, and there's reasons for saying this, I'm not sure they're completely compelling, but there are a group of dialogues in which Socrates basically ends up as confused as everybody else about the topic. Then there's another group of dialogues, including the Republic, which is the real defense of Socrates, so it's a much more elaborate defense than the Apology, which is very small work. And in that, they're basically, Socrates seems to know all sorts of things, and he can, as the Republic does, he comes up with an ideal city-state. So what's the best way to govern people? What's the best way to live? He answers that. He doesn't leave it all up in the air. And the third lot is dialogue in which Socrates is just sitting around listening, and other people are instructing him, and the dialogues tend to not be very question and answer. Some of them are, but some of them, they're basically just long trains of speaking, in which it's still set up as Socrates is listening, but he's just basically going, disappears for 10 pages. Oh, okay, maybe ask a question. So they're like that. But that's what you can see is that certainly this question of method is something that Plato is trying to really map out. And when we get to Aristotle, we'll see that, well, Aristotle did write dialogues, but we've lost them. He was supposed to have written rather beautiful dialogues. We've got lecture notes from Aristotle. So when we get to Aristotle, we're not seeing a drama anymore, we're seeing a series of lectures. And so the detail about the method is even more rigorously mapped out in Aristotle, though as we will see there are certain differences between the two and what they come up with. So the Socratic method, question and answer, is called dialectical. It's very different. We will use that term again later, much later in the semester when we talk about Karl Marx. But in the case of Socrates, dialectical simply means assembling a group through, and the word dia is Greek for the word through, assembling them to a common definition. You're looking for a definition that will help you see with the mind's eye. This becomes very important. I'll get back again to that. The mind's eye. So you see the thing in itself. You really see with your mind, by using this method, what it is you're looking for. You can find it with the mind. This is the thing in itself. And the big questions that Socrates and then Plato asked are questions of value. And the greatest value is what is good. But what is justice? What is truth? He also asks questions like what is courage? What is piety? Different dialogues have basically based around the different questions. Each genus has many species, and that we'll see is called the idea. I think I've already gone into this, so I'm not going to. Is there anything on this point? I've talked about the polyform nature, the inventiveness of the Greeks. The inventiveness comes from philosophy, even politics as a democratic practice comes with the Greeks. I mentioned this about the Persians. You could say the birth of Western science, that we can go back a bit and say one of the things that preceded Socrates, and Socrates says he wasn't really interested in nature. Not really interested in nature. He's interested in the human stuff. But there were a number of philosophers that preceded Socrates in which this dialectical method wasn't really so important, but which the speculative account of reality. Remember me talking about the one and the many? Well, they were trying to find the one of everything. What holds all life together? And they all came up, a bunch of them came up with different answers. Daly said everything is water. Water because things grow. Without water, things won't grow, things won't be alive. Others said it was air. Others said it was just the infinite. Others said it's little bits of seeds of everything. Others said it was earth, fire, or fire, the logos. Others, like Parmenides, said it's just one thing. It's everything in one. So you can see there's a lot of different answers to what that question is, but they're seeking the one and the many. And as I said, what Socrates does is he takes that from the more cosmological position and he just puts it into everyday life, into how we live and how the virtues are. But we can see that this search for unity within many, or within the many thing, is a kind of scientific breakthrough, and perhaps the best example of that in terms of subsequent rediscovery and application was the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus, who basically said, and of course they had no proof for this, but everything is made up of atoms. Of course, we're now used to a subatomic world, but in its way, that is saying there's some components of things that are all similar, but it's how they accumulate, the combination that they have in common is what makes things what they are. That's a fantastic insight of this speculative imagination, we could say. So, okay, but it was this rational component of thinking, this speculative component, then expanded into everyday life by Socrates, that becomes decisive in this new way of thinking about society. Now, let's turn to the Republic. The Republic, res publica means thing of the people, that's the Roman name for it, but the subtitle of the book is on the just, and the question that governs the book is what is justice. And even before Plato has Socrates answer it, so I might weave between Plato and Socrates when I say this, right? Because Socrates is the main character, asking the questions but also giving the answers of this book. And the book, the first thing about the book is it begins at the end of a sacrifice to the gods, a public festival where sacrifice has been made to the gods. Why does it begin like that? Well, that's Plato's way of showing it's not true that Socrates didn't worship the gods. What mattered for Greek life, as it would matter for the Romans, it's not really an interior faith. That's a Christian Jewish thing, or Jewish Christian thing. It's not that at all. It's the performing of public duty and public recognition of the spirit that oversees the city, that protects the city, the gods, because it's polytheistic, there's many gods. So the spirit that is overlooking the city, you've got to show that you're a member of that community by binding with other citizens of that group and making common sacrifice. Now this is something really, really important, which is not to say the other stuff I haven't said isn't important too, but this is really important. Pre-modern peoples, one and all, everywhere we look, they recognize the value, the supreme value of sacrifice. That human society is recognizable as a sacrificial order. That everybody who is a constituent part of that is meant to be making a sacrifice in order to make the whole thing work. So there's sacrifice of the warriors, their life. There's sacrifices of women, their freedom, especially in Athens. Athens was much less freer for women than in Sparta. But in that particular sacrificial ordering, the Spartans as a whole had sacrificed all sorts of freedoms in order to be Spartans. They weren't like the Athenians, as I said. So they've forgone all these other things. So the sacrifice is both to forgo, but also to be bound up with a role and a task and a set of expectations that had evolved. It's very easy for modern people just to look back and just give a name to it, like it's patriarchal or it's exploitative. Well, it's just much more complex than that. Even let's take slavery. Let's take slavery, which is in a sense highly important to all ancient societies once they get of any large scale. So tribes, they're often too small to have slaves. But once they start getting slaves, then they have to be able to ensure that the slave doesn't rebel. So you need a certain scale to make slavery work. Now, what is the ancient slave? Well, the ancient slave is someone who's been defeated in battle. Another way of saying that is someone who's been defeated in battle and you've spared their life. And you've spared their life, so they owe you their life. They don't have any freedom because you have usurped their freedom. Over time, and we see Aristotle wrestling with this problem, that he's by no means the first to have done this, that as slave society becomes more common, or as slavery becomes more common, more ubiquitous in society, and as the scale of it expands, and it's never on the scale of what the Romans were, simply because of the kind of farms and the size of them that they managed, that the Greeks managed. But once you've got more and more slaves, then the question of their necessity becomes a bit open for grabs. So then the prospect of freeing slaves becomes an issue. And very often the slaves are working, especially in Greece, are working in such close proximity to the family that the master will want to free the slave, that they've developed a real bond and a real friendship. But in and of itself, if we go back to the legitimation of slavery, and it could be very cruel, and it's like I said when I was talking about sacrificial obligation, I'm not saying that everybody made sacrifices, because you had tyrants as well. You know, you had people, but in a sense, if you were outside the sacrificial order, that made you suspect to the rest of the population. And that meant, you know, by what right do you have that authority? Are you in violation of the gods? You're not under this. You're not part of the sacrificial order. So sacrificial order is, in the ancient world, a fundamental way of understanding the world, which is completely vanished in modern times. Well, you don't even hear that formulation. Anyway, occasionally you hear politicians say someone will have to make sacrifices. Usually it means someone else, not them. You know, so when we're looking at the Republic, as I said, we're seeing Socrates, Plato's Socrates, or Plato defends Socrates, and we're not only seeing Plato do a portrait of what he thinks is the greatest person that ever lives, he's also wanting to depict the greatest possible form of human association, human formation, political body that could be. This is the aspiration. But it can only be that great if it's resting upon justice. So that's why the conversation begins with a group of young men. And Socrates used to go to the gym, he used to hang around young men. There's all sorts of, and Athenian culture was very homoerotic, homosexual culture. Socrates flirts with the young men, but Plato makes a big thing of this, because in his very last dialogue, you can see Plato has really turned against that homosexual culture. He's really turned against it. But Socrates is always presented as someone, in a sense, who flirts with the young man, who plays with them, but it's the mind that he's trying to seduce, not the body. And in one of the great dialogues of Plato, maybe the most beautiful of Platonic dialogues, is a dialogue called the Symposium. There's a section where Alcibiades, who was a very ambitious and brilliant strategic warrior, fighter, but who led a disastrous expedition in the Peloponnesian War, which led to a lot of deaths. And then he went and fought on the side of the Trojans, and not Trojans, Spartans, one side, get support from the Persians, This is not that uncommon, by the way, in the Greek conflicts. It's like people changing sides. But he had come to be really hated by many of the Greeks, and that was something else in Socrates' disfavour. He had been Alcibiades' teacher, as well as the teacher of the member of the tyrants' film. But Alcibiades wanders into this dialogue, and he tells a story. Alcibiades was reputed to be a very beautiful, young, strong guy. In a homoerotic culture, everyone would want Alcibiades. And he tells a story of how he tries to seduce Socrates, and he lay in Socrates' arm all right, but nothing happened. All that Socrates wanted to do was touch his mind. And that's so there is this kind of erotic dimension in the Platonic dialogues, but it is again, as the dialogue, the symposium argues, that the erotic is just an energy to try and get you to transform your energies into the higher things of the mental life. So when the Republic begins, after they've done the festival, we see a group of young men hanging out with Socrates, and the dialogue will basically begin when they go back to one of these young men's house, and they have a conversation. And it's quite funny, really, because there's about 4 or 5 people in the dialogue, but once you've got about halfway into it, there's only one person left answering. The rest have gone to sleep or snuck away. You don't know what's happened to them, but they've vanished in some way, shape, or form. But they're going to have a good discussion about justice. So this is as presented by Socrates. This is what ambitious yet concerned for the future of the city, for political life, people do. They sit around and they talk about this, and they talk about with Socrates, who's their teacher, but who keeps teaching through asking questions, professing his own ignorance, but getting the other person to answer it. So they build this ideal city, and that's exactly what it is. It's an ideal city. But the question at the basis of it is, what is justice? And there are a few answers that are given throughout, and I'll just briefly run through this. And the first one is actually given by the father of one of the young men, who's on his way out to go and make a sacrifice to the gods. So they've come back from one sacrifice, but the father's going out again to make another sacrifice. I think it's very clever, and I think Plato at times has all sorts of really subtle, imaginative triggers in there for his audience, so they could get a good picture of the psychology or social psychology that he's looking at. Because the father just says, it's obeying the elders and traditions. And then he goes off, basically. Because that's what he's doing. But Socrates then will point out, well, what if they're no good? What if they're bad traditions? What if they're broken traditions? Which is exactly what Plato and Socrates thinks has happened in Athens. Traditions. They've left us. So the next answer by his son, Polemarchus, whose place it is it's returning debts owed. And he basically answers, but what is it if you have to return, someone lends you a knife and then they want it back and they want to go and kill someone, should you return that? Oh, no. So they start to, and as these definitions are developing, one of the things that Socrates is showing is very often a poet has been cited as the authority to give you the definition. So this comes back to the fact, which again I'll go into that, because a huge part of the Republic is a critique, a sustained critique of the poets. And you're doing education, and the first book in the philosophy of education is always this book, I don't know if you know that yet, but the Republic is the foundational text on the philosophy of education. And the philosophy of education is basically, in part, philosophy against all other potential educators. And as I said, the Greeks, the educators, the primary educators, were the poets. They'd be cited in the law courts, in the assemblies, where people gather together to make political decisions. Then it becomes helping friends and harming enemies. And you can see pretty well straight away, well, what if the friends are no good, So that's no good. But then one of the characters is someone who's meant to be an orator stroke sophist, a guy called Thrasymachus. He gets really irritated with Socrates, and he storms up and he says, it's just the interest of the stronger. Don't you get it? Don't you get it? Now, there's two aspects of this, and he will eventually storm off. That what is being said is a view of justice which has certain degree of truth in it, and it's essentially prefiguring what Karl Marx will say, or even before that Thomas More will say in his little work, The Utopia, written around 1500, but Karl Marx in the 19th century will say. And that is that the word justice is just a smokescreen for people to exert their power. So people who are not just are saying, do this, do that, because that's just. So what they're saying is power is not evenly distributed, not fairly, not justly distributed. So when they invoke justice, they're not really being just. Now, as soon as I've said it that way, you might see there's a contradiction. Given that Socrates hasn't asked for what is injustice, he's asked for what is justice. And as you will see, if you in the reading there, I've given you the example of the shepherd, and you know, what is the shepherd doing, and why is he doing what he's doing? And anyway, in this insight of Socrates, he's saying, look, you're only able to say that because somewhere you have an idea of what justice is, and you think it's not being met. So that's why you say that. Are you with me there? Has that made sense? You're saying justice is just a smokescreen for injustice. But I'm not asking what is injustice. I'm asking what is real justice. I'm not asking what feigning justice is. I'm asking what is real justice. And that leads then to, and this very logical sequence, you know, I'm not asking what it is to feign justice, to be justice. And one of the characters in the dialogue, and the major character that will come is a guy called Glaucon, and this is his brother Adamantus, and after this bit he will disappear too. He picks up on this feigning position. He says, well, wouldn't the best thing to do to be pretend to be just but not be just? Wouldn't that be the best thing? And they then talk about this example of what's called the ring of Gyges. And the ring of Gyges, you put this ring on your finger, you disappear, you become invisible. And then you can do whatever you like. Take what you want, do what you want, get up to all sorts of shenanigans, and you get away with it. So it's an ultimate in appearances and concealment. So that leaves Socrates with the problem of having to demonstrate why justice is good in itself. You can see that. Why is it good in itself? And elsewhere, though this is implicated in this work, but in another dialogue, especially a fantastic dialogue called the Gorgias, he argues it's better to suffer wrong than do wrong. In some way, shape or form, he has got to show that to be the case. Now, as soon as I say that, you can see why within the Christian tradition there would be certain features of Socrates that people at different times would think, yeah, we're really on the same page as this. It would be better to suffer wrong than do wrong. My soul is mine. I cannot infect it with evil. I have to keep it pure. This is basically what Socrates is saying. So the question is, but why? Now, this putting the question this way, and again I'll mention the dialogue with Gorgias. Putting the question this way, it's a very nihilistic. It's really saying, let's say there's nothing of value except what we say there is. And this is what a number of sophists and orators had been seen as teaching. There's really nothing of value except what we say. And in the dialogue with Gorgias, the critique that Gorgias was a very famous orator. And Gorgias went round saying, you know, nothing exists, and if it did exist, we couldn't say anything about it, so nothing really matters. And the other sophistic formulation was man is the measure of things. So it's just what we say is the truth. What we say has value, has its value. Now, you can see that is going to be a serious problem if what you're searching for is harmony, concord, another kind of sacrificial order which the mind can discover and provide, which is exactly what Plato is doing. He's looking for harmony. That's the key word. He's looking for, and the virtues here, and justice itself, there's ultimately has to be a form of harmony. So he's looking for that. Now, one of the characters in the Gorgias, that is one of the people that Gorgias teaches is a character called Callicles. And in the ancient world, it was said that Callicles is based upon Plato's image of himself had he not come across Socrates. Whether that's true or not, but that was what was reported to be the case. Now, the reason I say that is because Callicles argues that basically all societies' laws are basically due to the weak conspiring against the strong. And the strong should not listen to them. And if they can get away with being a tyrant, then hell, they should be a tyrant. So one of the things that's happening in the Republic, so that's in the, and that's a great dialogue, because there's one point where Socrates is trying to convince Callicles, he recognizes the power of Callicles, but Callicles just stops talking at him. And all Socrates can do is keep talking, but it's like, he's talking for others, not Callicles, because Callicles doesn't listen. So what Plato is wanting Socrates to demonstrate in the Republic, and indeed in the whole corpus of his works in which Socrates appears, is to demonstrate that Socrates' life is so great that the alternative is not as good. Or to put it another way, there's two extremes of life. And he sees that one of them is the perennial temptation of the Greeks. And in one dialogue called the Theages, Theages, in the Theages, he has one character. We're not sure if Plato actually wrote this, but it's attributed to him. There's one character say, all us Greeks want to be tyrants. We all want to be tyrants. And there's something in the Republic that suggests that if Plato didn't write the Theages, it was someone who knew Plato well, because that's exactly what Plato thinks. So the big temptation for all these young, politically interested men, and remember me saying Cleon actually was a tyrant. He was one of the 30 tyrants. One of Socrates' students, that they would be tempted by the tyrannical life. And the Republic is an attempt to show that the tyrannical life is the worst life, and the philosophical life is the best life. Whether or not you think he's right, that's another question altogether, but that's what it's. So, where we've reached this, this very nihilistic moment, and a nihilistic moment, to repeat, is Adeimantus saying, well, just appear to be, but do what you want. Just be your will to power, but recognize the weak are what they are, and go along with them as much as you can on the surface, but don't do it anymore. So to make the case for not only the philosophical life, so there's a personal dimension, but for what life could be if the society were better formed and shaped. And this means, when I say that, I can't help thinking how Plato's way of thinking about life is still such a part of how we think. Because we don't blink and thinking, oh, let's think about how society should be shaped in the best possible way. We don't blink at that. If you think about most people on the planet over most time, you'd realize that's not a typical question. That suggests, A, that you've got the intelligence to do it, and 2, that you may be able to do it. But that's exactly what Plato wants us to embrace. That's exactly what I wants us to embrace. I'm thinking of all the problems I can see with that, but I won't go into that. So he's looking at justice in terms of its nature and its desirability, but also the just life in terms of its nature and desirability. And he says at this moment, look, to understand justice, let's go from the micro, the personal, to the macro. Now, as he does this, actually, we're really learning a lot about the character of Socrates. So we never really leave the micro, but we get caught up in the conversation where Socrates now directs a conversation, where the others pretty well go to sleep at this point, directs a conversation in which the whole emphasis is upon what would be the best kind of political world that you could live in. And so that becomes a question. So, and it would be based upon justice. It would have to be just, because justice is, in a sense, the virtue that holds the society together. Now, the virtues, by the way, which in Plato include wisdom, justice, piety, courage, and one called temperance. Well, we tend to think of the Temperance League, even if you think of that. But he's really balanced, a balanced personality. And when we come to look at Socrates' critique of the poets, one of the central critiques is they throw people out of balance, that the soul loses its poise when it is inflamed by the passions. And so the job of the philosopher is to reach a state in which there is kind of collectedness and calmness in the face of foreboding, in the face of terror, in the face of all the trials of life. Not to respond with a scream and a cry. In fact, a whole branch of philosophy called the Stoics really is built around that very aspect of Socrates' response. It's a very Socratic idea, though, originally. Okay, let's do one more slide. So, the ideal city-state, it's a utopia. That word appears in the book. Utopia means nowhere. It's not anywhere except in the mind. But the whole point of it is to show us the irrationality, the lack of reason in how we are living collectively, how we're living. So, you had raised earlier the distinction between knowledge and opinion, and this becomes a fundamental divide in the Platonic understanding of reality. There are people who have opinion and people that know. And how do we know there are people who have opinion, and how do we know? And this is where Plato says, well, if you look at the craftsmen, the artisans, and when he wasn't hanging around with the young lads in the gym, that's also where Socrates could be found, talking to the cobblers and the flute makers and all the other carpenters, whatever, because what Socrates and then Plato are emphasizing is that when it comes to learning something, someone who pursues a skill has to really follow a set of procedures. And the value then of what they've made, whether it's a table or a chair or whatever, the value of it will ultimately depend upon the user will go, that's a good table, that's a good flute, that's a good, they can tell, someone can tell them, but in the making of it, they can't just proceed haphazardly. And basically, Socrates is saying, how is it that when it comes to making a table, we think of having requisites in the skill, developing the knowledge to be able to make something is really important. But when it comes to talking politics, we can just rummage around all over our place and not be beholden to any stringent method. So the whole dialogue then is about stringency of method. Again, whether or not it is exactly like that, that's open to contestation, but that's certainly what Socrates and Plato are arguing, and you can see that, well, that's a pretty plausible position. That's not something you can just dismiss lightly. And in fact, you could say that every state in the world has ever been reliant upon people that have knowledge, and they're the bureaucracy. They require, the administration of the state requires a group of people that know things. Whether or not their knowledge is based upon the best motive is another thing altogether, or whether it's even the best knowledge is another thing altogether. But that knowledge is important, is the very basis of what Plato is going to set up. And he then moves, so basically on that principle, he moves from the rudiments of social organization to a more sophisticated kind of city state. It's the first, there's basically two city-states two ideal cities in the Republic. The first one, Glaucon says that's a city fit for pigs. And he says that because there's almost nothing in it. It's a very austere, ultra-Spartan, if I'm to use that word in both senses, of a real people and the way we use it metaphorically today, a sort of ultra-Spartan environment. So when Socrates, when Glaucon says that to Socrates, Socrates says, okay, we're going to need more stuff. We're going to need the tradesmen, and we're going to need the farmers, and we're going to need all this. It won't just be, and that means that there's likelihood of us being attacked, because if we didn't have much property, no one would probably be that interested in it. Of course they would, because you could still be slave material. So, so that's not quite true. But anyway, no one would be so interested in it. Is the way I argued. And so let's build this other city. And here he then there's two components. The first is he argues, and Aristotle will criticize this. He'll say this is rubbish. But Plato says, or Socrates says, to get the best out of people, people should focus on one thing. And you can see again that's very skill related. If you really want to devote yourself to a craft, do it all the time. But of course life's not like that. And there is a kind of transmission of tacit talents from one thing to another that Plato doesn't really think about. But anyway, so one man, one task. The next thing he does, he divides the society into three classes. There's the ruling class, and that's going to be akin to the brain, reason. There's the willful energy, the preparedness to do it, which is what you want in a warrior class, or what he calls the guardian class, or the watchdogs. And then there's just the producers and the craftsmen, the people who provide the stuff that is necessary for the social reproduction of that city. Now, the third lot basically vanish, and we pretty well don't see anything about them, except there's one bit where Socrates gets in the position, and not uncommon, of treating human beings much like animals, and it does a kind of animal husbandry in terms of breeding. And he's raising and the question pops up, well, what we're wanting is the smartest and the strongest, and then there's the rest that can do the stuff. But what if we got some dummies who's supposed to be in the warriors, or weaklings, or dummies who are supposed to be in the rulers? What are we going to do about that? And what if there's some smart, stronger ones with the hoi polloi, the many, hoi polloi is Greek for many, and the mob? What do we do? And so you've got this kind of baby smuggling exchange racket that is going on. And it's also going on in the context of, there's another part of the Republic, again, this is criticized by Aristotle, where he says the ruling group and the philosophers and the warrior guardians, that they should not marry, they should not have private property, and they should not have a family. So they're forgoing all of that, and there would be, so occasionally they get together to procreate, but sexual energy has to be kept under control, but occasionally you have to get together to reproduce. Again, you start to think this is sound a bit, this looking a bit wacky. And there's a whole lot of people who interpret Plato saying he's not really being serious about this. I'm afraid I can't agree with them, because and they say, oh, look, it's really comic. Well, it may be comic because it is comic, but it doesn't mean it doesn't take it seriously. And it is the kind of, it's not a million miles away from the kind of things the Spartans were doing anyway, who would all eat in tents. I mean, they still had families there, but they basically were a collective as much as possible. And so this I think comes from the Spartan thing, and it's also here that I'll mention the question of the equality of the sexes comes up. Now, Plato is not interested, and you have to be very careful about this, he's not interested in the freedom of anybody as such. It's not about freedom. So if we're thinking in terms of modern ideas about freedom and equality, that's not what is interesting Plato. What is interesting him is mental talent. And he does think, and again, this is much closer to the Spartans and would be something that the Athenians would be really horrified by. But he does think that the women and the men could perhaps do gymnastics together, and that the women can be guardians. And and in fact, in one dialogue, again, the symposium, which I mentioned earlier, there is a woman who is a philosopher who is Socrates' teacher. So in principle, Although in the main, we don't really, apart from Diotima, this fictional character, we don't see women or hear women speaking in any of the Platonic dialogues except the Symposium. In the Republic, we can see the idea that it's not so important what gender you are as what talent you've got. So that's his interest in it, but it would be a very long bow to try and put him in the history of feminist philosophy, because it's just a whole other set of priorities and emphasis. And elsewhere, basically, Plato has one of his characters say, Socrates, say that, you know, it's a really tragic thing. It's not a good thing to be born a woman. And in terms of opportunities, you could say that's probably true in Athens. Women were kept out of public life. One of the Aristophanes wrote another play called The Assembly of Women, which is a very funny play, in which the women dress up as men and then take over the assembly and change the laws to suit their needs. So there's obviously some interest in this issue that is happening, and Aristotle will also talk about the role of men and women. And again, I'll say that if you look at the much greater freedom that women had in Spartan life compared to the Athenian life, even though it was much more militaristic society, you could see that the Athenians were keeping women pretty well under lock and key in that society. And it's not so much that Plato wants to change that for the sake of liberty. He's ultimately looking at how to maximize intelligence in order to govern the society. Okay, let's end it there. Look, I've had a lot of fun. I like doing this. Will you come along next week and I carry on, or? Okay. Would you rather I do it this way? I'm going to turn this off and I'll make a decision. Just 1 second.